all his achievements and things that he's currently doing. He's editor in all of the top 2 journals of the field, and he has published in, I would say, all of the things that you can publish on in eye psychology, strongly also on research methods, which is, and one of the things that I remember when Steven Roger was here in Chile, he told us that he was the fastest and more efficient reviewer he had on his review board. So
I remember he said Fred is the 20-minute feedback person.
Yes.
I don't know if that's good or bad, but you know, try to get things back to people.
So again, we're very happy to have you here, Fred. It's very early in Houston. It's 7:30 now, so we'll get started so that he doesn't fall asleep in the next few minutes.
Hey. No problem. Well, thank you for the invitation, and really it's me who's honored to be able to present to you all, and more importantly, hope to impart some, you know, if you get a few good ideas out of this talk, I'll be pretty happy. And I'm always welcome to conversation if you want to reach out afterward. If you see a fit or have a question that comes up afterward as a, aha, I should reach out, please do. And then of course, during this talk, I'm not sure how conversational I'll be. Sometimes I tend to ramble, but you can always interrupt me to make it conversational. And then we have time at the end as well for conversation. I certainly hope not to talk for an hour and a half. So let me share my slides. And we will get to it. Let's see my PowerPoint. Oh, maybe, hold on just a sec. Okay, there it is. And there it is. Okay. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. Let me see if I can get, okay, and now I can pull up your gallery and see you. Excellent. Okay, so again, thank you so much. I'm really grateful to be able to present and join you all, and hope to impart a few ideas. I'm not sure how much big data kind of orientation you have, or machine learning orientation you have. Some of, there's usually some variability. Some people have some and some people don't. So I'm gonna risk telling you some things you might already know, or reinforce some concepts from the onset to talk about what machine learning algorithms do. And the reason to do that is to give you a sensitivity to the broader picture that I'll transition to, which is how do these algorithms fit into the landscape of AI and big data and all these words people throw around. And then finally, I'll conclude, and maybe this will lead to more conversation, is how to fit this into your, whether it's research or practice. What are some kind of issues to think about? And I'll raise those at a high level, but then we can go as specific as you want. So need a little coffee here. Okay. All right, so the idea here is, we have a lot to learn from big data and AI. The field is changing very quickly, so it's almost like trying to paint a moving train. By the time you're done, you definitely have to start over again. And that's true with many fields with constant evolution. But we have a lot to learn in a field that itself is accelerating. It's the issue. But I think there are some fundamentals that can be readily appreciated and useful even in light of these changes. Just like t-tests are still useful, even though they were invented long ago, we use them all the time. So the way to position this talk, oops. The way to position this talk is to say that we do formal modeling, right? And, you know, it can be relatively simple. You know, here I'm showing some linear regressions. There's a quadratic term thrown in on the right. So you can do some nonlinearity. We are inductive and deductive in the sense that, you know, a model such as the bottom left might be a model where you could have no hypotheses. These could literally be descriptives, or you could impose a structured model where you thought the orange bars interacted with the blue bars such that the positions were reversed in terms of the means or something like that. And that's kind of what you see here if you squint. It's not necessarily true to have that model. I'm just saying, like, oh, I'm drawing a continuum here from exploration, looking at data, to trying to summarize it intelligently through models and to test models that satisfy your, or that test your assumptions. So, you know, obviously the model on the bottom right is a structural equation model, and that's where we get pretty serious about our a priori assumptions about how variables are related, right? We draw arrows from one variable to another and say, this is the way it is, and we estimate those parameters for relationships. But even more striking in confirmatory models like this are the arrows you don't see. That's the strongest part of the claim, right? When you see no arrow, I don't know, let's pick one from service quality to, looks like university image down there. There's no arrow. You're saying that relationship is literally zero, right? And that is a strong claim. So the constraints you place on a model are really making bold claims, and if the model fits despite those constraints, then that's a victory for parsimony and for science, right? Because you've explained something in simpler terms. So this is the old world, right? In terms of this talk, these are how this, you know, in broad brush strokes, how we think about data from confirmatory and exploratory approaches. Now we go into some big data thinking, where the goal is prediction. That's the goal. I mean, well, you can also do clustering, and I'm not going to talk about that so much today, but there are two rough areas. One is clustering, right? Groups of people, figuring out like consumer preferences or types of people who turn over, things like that, groups of occupations. But here we're going to focus on prediction, where the sole goal is to predict standing on a single dependent variable, and to do so out of sample. So when you see data here in this figure, you see that you know, you could fit the data with a simple line on the left. Science prefers parsimony. So what better than to summarize a ton of data points with two numbers, a slope and an intercept, right? That's great. If that works, and nothing, you know, there's always going to be unpredictable variance. So I'm not saying works doesn't mean your R squared has to be 0.99. It means that there's no really other sufficient model to account for those data. Okay, well, if you think that's too simple, you might go to the upper right and say, well, let's fit every data point. Well, you know, only people like us would laugh at that, but we would laugh at that because it's clearly overfitting, right? If you pour in data from an out of sample, you know, a fresh new data that was not involved in developing the model, you would get poorer prediction. You might even get zero prediction. So the goal, like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, that's the bottom right, my little joke, is to get it just right. Don't be too simple and don't be too complex, and make the model, what if you could make the model be flexible to be somewhere between these 2 points on the continuum, and figure out which model works in the middle sense, in the sense that it will be effective with out-of-sample prediction, and it will do that to the maximal extent possible. So in other words, it's not gonna, you're not gonna settle for a line, you're not gonna settle for a really complex curve, you're not gonna choose it beforehand and then fit that to data. What you're gonna do is essentially be flexible and figure out how to adjust a model in a way that will accommodate the data, but make robust predictions out of sample. You see what I mean? So it's kind of like an adjustment mechanism we'll be talking about. And this will become more clear very quickly. And in fact, big data takes this to the extreme, this idea of model adjustment and the idea of robust prediction to the nth degree. So, okay, so I'm going to give you an example of a machine learning algorithm. And there are hundreds of machine learning algorithms available, right? If you look up machine learning algorithms, there's one being developed every day. We'll see one today, I'm sure. You know, there are families of machine learning algorithms, variations on a theme. For psychological data, you know, I know I'm being recorded, so I'm never going to put my bet on any single algorithm because these things change. But I would say that, you know, the biggest limitation to our ability to predict using machine learning is our data. It's not our models, it's our data, right? I mean, like, think about the criteria used in organizations and how they can be improved. Think about how personnel selection, recruiting, management, think about all the things we do as experts in IO psychology and organizational behavior that could stand to be improved. Those things will make machine learning better. And I'll return to that point later. For now, let's look at machine learning while realizing that there are other machine learning approaches that take on entirely different approaches, have a different philosophy fundamentally, and yet what's the word? The theme, the purpose is exactly the same. Exactly. Maximize prediction out of sample, right? Do robust prediction. For today, we're not doing clustering. All these hundreds of algorithms are trying to do that. So for machine learning, here's what you do in terms of random forests. So as the name implies, a forest consists of trees. You can write that down. And a tree, we're going to look at what a tree is, and then we'll get to the forest, okay? So we're going to build a random forest out of trees, and here's a picture of a tree. And the way I reach this tree is through a certain procedure. So let's say I have a big data set with 1,000 variables, okay? Or actually, let's say 10,000 because often what people do is take the square root of the number of variables out of the bag, essentially. If you have a bag of variables and you're building a tree, you take the number of variables, like 10,000, and then you take the square root out of the bag, which is 100 in this case, and then you will be choosing among those 100. So the bag is your entire, does that make sense? The bag is your entire set of variables that you're using in a big data application. And for the purpose of building a tree, I'm going to start with 100 variables, and I'm not going to look at the rest, okay? Obviously, you don't see 100 variables here. You only see a few. So how do I pick these? The procedure is, and I didn't build slides that build this up in sequence, but imagine that the top of the tree starts first, okay? How did I choose cognitive ability? So you have to do some imagining for me and just look at cognitive ability with the red arrow and green arrow sticking out. And we're predicting task performance from cognitive ability, okay? The way we got the green and red arrows, and that's a divide, right? High cognitive ability, low cognitive ability, right? You're above a score or you're below a score. What is that score? Essentially, the score that's chosen for cognitive ability is the one that maximizes the difference between high and low on the outcome, task performance. So it's almost like a create your own ANOVA, right? Create your own ANOVA, split cognitive ability, you know, the distribution of cognitive ability scores, split that into two groups along the continuum. So run your, you know, your knife or along the normal curve continuum of cognitive ability. And as you move the knife along the continuum, look at what predicted task performance is for the high scores on cognitive ability and for the low scores on cognitive ability. Look at the means, right? And stop your knife when the means show the biggest difference between the high and the low, right? That means you're discriminating as high as possible, right? Any questions, any concerns about that? Okay, I see a lot of joy in your faces. Okay, the question then is, why cognitivity? Why is that there and not the 99 other variables that I had? Well, the machine, as you run the algorithm, actually is looking at all 100 variables that you took out of the bag. And it's choosing the one that shows the biggest difference between high and low means on task performance. So to put those ideas together, right? Within each variable, you're running the knife along the distribution, you're stopping where the means are the largest difference. So you're doing that across all 100 variables. You're stopping where the means are the biggest. Then you look across all the variables and you say, okay, what's the biggest of the biggest, right? Each variable, I stopped where the biggest difference was. So within each variable, I've got the biggest difference on high and low mean task performance, right? I already explained that. And then across all the 100 variables, I'm choosing the biggest difference out of where I stopped on every variable. Are we good there? So once you pick, now you pick cognitive ability and your other 99 variables are sad because they didn't get picked. So what do? You throw them back into the bag. Actually, you throw them all back into the bag. So even cognitive ability goes back into the bag. So it could be pulled out again as a candidate for consideration as you move down the tree. So you pull out another 100 at random from the bag and you play the same game. Does that make sense? And I do it on the subsets. So I pull it out of the bag and play this game for those who scored low on cognitive ability. And turns out I chose conscientiousness. And then I, throw the variables back in. I pull out 100 out of the bag for the high in cognitive ability, the bio data. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense how it builds on each other. And there are rules for how the trees get built apart from that I won't totally get into. I'll talk a little bit more about this. One is depth, right? So how deep do you make your trees? So this is like a depth of 3, more or less. And the random forest is going to create a bunch of these trees, like hundreds, right? Like 500 trees. The idea is that each tree is making fairly weak predictions. I mean, you had 10,000 variables after all. Now you only chose 5. And not only did you choose 5, look at what you did to those 5. You remember when intro stats, you were told never dichotomize your variables? You just did it again and again and again. So you created these, and the second point is, can you see how these are like interactions, right? Very complicated, not like Stat 101, but it's interactions, right? Whether you get scored on conscientiousness, whether your scores on conscientiousness matters, depends on your score on cognitive ability. It's only included if you have a low score. If you have a high score on cognitive ability, conscientiousness doesn't get considered, right? So that's an example of the interaction that's involved in this tree. So it's, the trees are complicated in the sense of interactions, but they're really simple in terms of depth. And what that leads to is, across trees is where the power comes in. And that, I think, that leads to my next slide. So we talked about how the trees are being built. We're going to build like, 500 of them or something. each time we build a tree, we talked about how we sample the variables at each node of the tree. We did not talk about how we sampled the data. And the way we sample the data is through bootstrapping. So you're familiar with bootstrapping? Bootstrapping means sampling with replacement, right? So if I have a sample of, I'll just say 300, that's not exactly big data, but you have a sample of 300, and if you're bootstrapping, each bootstrap sample will also be 300 cases, okay? But some cases will repeat more than once, and other cases won't appear at all, right? So you're sampling 300 times randomly with replacement from the original sample. And the reason you're doing that is to insert, you're treating the sample as if it were the population, right? So the empirical density that you see in the sample is being reproduced, is treated as a population, and then you witness that across your bootstrap samples. You know, whether you should do that, and whether that leads to more accuracy, I mean, some of these things can get philosophical, but the reason we do that here is that it does try to go for robustness. You know, it does, as long as your sample is representative, right? If your sample is very radically different from the other samples you plan to predict in the future, all bets are always off, right? But as long as you're, you know, in the ballpark, this is a reasonable thing to do. And what you get to do after you build these diverse trees is when you did the bootstrap sample, the part of the data that was not sampled for each tree gets to go through the tree, right? So like take tree 1, I do a bootstrap sample, I said 300 cases. Some cases said, hey, what about me? You didn't sample me, right? And then you say to those cases, just wait a minute, let me build this tree. You build the tree, and then you say, okay, cases, come back in and give us predictions, right? So roughly speaking, 1/3 of the data each time do not get sampled in a bootstrap sample. So on average, there are highs and lows to this. 1/3 of your data will get a predicted value for each tree each time. That means, and if you do 500 trees or 1,000 trees, probabilistically, every case is going to have not just one predicted value, it'll have multiple predicted values across the trees that it did not participate in developing, right? It was holding back while the bootstrap sample built the trees. So for the trees it did not participate in developing, it will receive a predicted score, several of them. Okay, what do you do with that? Well, this illustrates it, what a spreadsheet might look like, or what R is doing in the background. You see each column is a tree, like the one I described, and each case is either in the tree or out of the tree. And so you can see for tree 1, case 1 was involved in building the tree. Case 2 and the last case, I didn't give you the whole spreadsheet, they were not involved in the tree. So you put the data, you run their data through it, you say, okay, you were high in conscientiousness, and I forget what the model looked like, high in biodata, here's your predicted score. You were low in conscientiousness, you know, you were high in, I forget what the other variables were, actually teamwork. And then you get a predicted value. So like I said, you know, K might be 500 trees. And you look across the rows and you see that each case has a predicted value, right? More than one predicted value. And so you'll average it across the trees to get a final predicted value. The idea here, well, there are many ideas, but the idea of averaging is that each tree is providing a weak prediction. You saw how simple the trees were, right? 3 layers, and yet they were complex. They reflected these interactions. And now you're averaging across trees that each have very different interactions. Whoa, right? That's kind of crazy, right? You may have never seen a model like this. I mean, but what you're doing as a function of that is you're exploiting complexity where it exists. Doesn't mean it exists, to be clear, right? You're exploiting complexity where it exists. If it exists and you have large enough sample size, and what that means is you have a large enough sample size to detect it, right? Just like traditional notions of statistical power. You have to have enough sample size to be able to detect it. You also have to have, it's always been true, but it seems a little more obvious with big data that you have to have the variables to detect it, right? That was always true in the past. Like if you didn't have a variable that theory would suggest, you have a deficient model that you're running. But here with big data, it's also true. Absent a theory, you have a hard drive with a bunch of HR data or something, and you're doing machine learning on it. Well, if you didn't have variables that mattered to predicting turnover that you thought would matter, your predictions are going to be not as good or even biased potentially. So that gets into some broader issues we'll get into in a minute. But I hope if I am not too tired, I hope I was clear enough where you got some insights about random forests and some insights about how these models are really pushing for, they're disturbing the models, right? Every tree is a different model in a sense. So they're like shaking the models up and averaging predictions across them. It's about as kind of robust as you can get in terms of trying out variations, right? And it's shaking up the sample, right? It's disturbing it. Every tree has a different data set going through it to get predicted about. They're overlapping data sets, but they're different in terms of the entire set. Every set is a little bit different. And so that's how it's going for robustness. Now you could say, and students have, I teach machine learning workshops and occasionally they'll say, well, what if one of those trees like really gave you the best prediction out of all of them, right? What if that was the golden tree and you lost it because you did all this averaging? You have to say, I mean, yeah, maybe there could be some exploratory tree-based function out there. There probably is. But overall, I think you have to abide by the philosophy that whatever seems good in one tree is kind of ephemeral. Like it's not going to last forever. We just like we don't want to capitalize on chance with regression, we don't want to capitalize on trees, right? We don't want to capitalize on any one finding. That would be a standard answer. Of course, as always, it's an empirical question. You might find the golden tree one day. Okay. This isn't working. I'll do this. Okay, so I think I've covered this pretty much. I've got a bit more to get through. So, one key point you've already seen is model diversity, that, if every tree produced the same predicted scores, why would you need to run hundreds of trees, right? You wouldn't. You would just need one. So you really, it's sort of a wisdom of the crowds approach that every tree is providing a slightly different and weak prediction, but together by combining them, you're getting some strength. And that's the idea you see on the right here, right? Every tree represented by the oval is giving a slightly different prediction. And by averaging them, you should be getting something better. Every prediction, every individual prediction does have value. It's not to say that they're useless, right? The whole reason why the average prediction is helpful is because each individual prediction has meaning, but it's unique and it's weak. And so by combining them, you're going to hopefully get something better. So there's my graphic of similar versus different trees. That took me like about 3 months to create. And then, okay, so here's a broad issue though. Are we doing Dust Bowl empiricism, right? We've worried about this in the past. The past was different though. Dust Bowl empiricism there was where we were fooled by small numbers, right? We overfit our models to data and we got p-values and we were excited about them. And Dust Bowl empiricism, not to every extent, but right, Dust Bowl wasn't always Dust Bowl, but we if we didn't have a strong theory, we often had reasonable thinking. And so there was some empiricism that has led to some important victories for our science. Knowledge predicting performance, right? I don't know if you need an extensive theory for that kind of idea. And it was largely driven by robust empirical findings, right? As one example. But there are other findings where you ran an experiment with 11 people, and your ANOVA found a significant effect. And even though the confidence interval around that effect had to be huge, right? You had to have a lot of error around 11 people. And even conceptually, right? Low power is not a statistical issue, it's a conceptual issue. Do you really want to hang your findings on 11 people? So that was then. That was decibel empiricism then. Decibel empiricism now is to say, well, okay, now let's take all the data we have available and make predictions. And they're going to be robust and out of sample. And we may not have a p-value, but we can reproduce it because we have this out of sample prediction, cross-validated prediction, et cetera. And so what do you do with that, right? And that's where issues of bias comes in, issues of ethics, right? That we often will find prediction that is robust through big data, but as you can see from random forest, we don't understand why. So that's the other, right? That's the thing from this explanation of random forest I hope you got is that's a black box, right? You don't know how prediction, I mean, you know how prediction happened from a very broad level. You know how you set up the algorithm, right? Hopefully, I'll quiz you after this, but you don't know why. You don't know the specifics of why. And that is where the critical thing is. So I haven't covered other methods like neural nets or support vector machines, right? Those are less interpretable methods. There's methods that are regression based, like elastic net and lasso, ridge regression. Elastic net combines lasso and ridge regression. Those are more interpretable. Those give you coefficients, right? They zero out a lot of variables, or they can, and you can get more interpretability. And that's for another day, another talk. Please invite me again, and we can talk about choice of model. Sometimes you do want that interpretability, and you might even sacrifice some prediction for the sake of interpretation, right? Just so you know that the variance that is being predicted is, quote, good variance, is measure driven. And you'll see I'll be pushing for that as I get through this talk, is measure. Our expertise comes in measurement, right? In knowing what is being predicted and in using theory and thinking and expertise to complement what computer scientists and applied statisticians are doing with big data. And I don't think we're going to go away. I could be wrong. Machine learning might even create an IO psychologist that outdoes us, but I like to not think so. I'm biased. I like my job, but we'll see. So signals are found in the data through machine learning. This is a broad issue, and we're getting into broader issues now. You ran your machine learning model, and this is a figure that has been in the computer science world has been referred to quite a bit. It's from 1996. It's really just showing stages that go from data that are collected to transforming it to doing the analyses, interpreting it. And then finally at the end there, I don't know if you have Doritos in Chile, but you have a Dorito of knowledge at the very end that you can eat, you can consume and enjoy. My addition to this figure is to suggest that it doesn't end there, right? You don't just run machine learning, find the knowledge and stop. You actually take that knowledge, and there's my arrow. Again, these are struggles for me to create, but you take that knowledge and you create new measures, right? So maybe a signal kind of came out through this machine learning, and maybe we'll have more advanced methods. I have to admit not to be a total machine learning expert, right? I don't know what kinds of, maybe there are more interpretation methods that can get into random forests and figure out what predicts. Like there's a method called LIME, locally interpretable machine explanation, something like that. And Lime, what it does is, if you think of the predictions from random forests as being really curvy and complicated, Lime zooms into a particular area of the curve where you're interested in prediction. And if you've taken calculus, or even if you haven't, if you zoom in far enough into a curve, really, really zoom in, it starts to look like a line, right? It starts to look linear. And if it looks linear, you can then start looking at predictors in a more like linear regression. And if you can do that, then you get into more interpretability. So imagine a linear regression where the variables and the coefficients change depending on where you're looking in the model of random forest. That's my intuition for what interpretability looks like for random forest. But the point of this slide is not exactly that. It's just to say that if we can get to that level of interpretability, then we can continue our big data journey. We can start potentially, right? HR or an organization provides you with a giant data set. You're like, oh, I'd love to measure this differently because I'm a psychologist and I have all these measures, but I'll take what I can get, right? I'm not gonna wait 6 months to collect off a measure. I'm gonna use big data. And maybe you get this, right? You run random forests, you get this Dorito of knowledge. Time passes, you're able to report your findings, and the decision makers, they say, oh, how can we capitalize on that? You say, well, I'm glad you asked. I'm a measurement expert, and I can take the signals that are within the noise and make it even stronger and dampen potential sources of variance that are irrelevant, right? That's what we do when we create multi-item measures, which I'll show in the next slide. So this is from your dreams or your nightmares about Stat 101, right? About how, or psychometrics, how you build measures. And the point here that I want to make is that when you add items to a scale, you're building up the correlation matrix, right? The correlation matrix gets bigger and bigger the more items you add, right? And if you have raw data, unstandardized data, your correlation matrix is called a variance covariance matrix. So don't be worried, but it's just like what you see there is like it's like a correlation matrix for raw data. And the point here is, if you notice, if you look from item 1 to item 7 and you run your eyes from the upper left to the bottom right, you can see that every time I add an item, I'm only adding one variance, right? But I'm adding a lot more covariances, right? When I get to item 7, I'm adding 6 covariances and I'm only adding 1 variance. So the point is, the covariances, or in standardized terms, the correlations, overwhelm the variances, right? And why does that matter? Well, correlations overwhelming the variance. Correlations, that's how the variables are related, right? That's the signal. That the signal is overwhelming any noise that's found in the unique part of the variance within each item, right? The quirks of every item, the unique part, that's found on the diagonal. That's the variance. So the quirks of every item become much more in the minority the more you build up these correlations. Does that make sense? So it's just conceptually, I'm showing you that the signal is getting stronger and stronger to dampen the noise found in the uniquenesses of each item in this case. You know, these don't have to be items. These could be pieces of big data that you assemble. So there are methods in the big data world to do clustering before you do prediction. So that's what you see here, right? Anytime we create a composite, we're clustering. Big data might do it differently. And my argument would be that we could think about a psychometric approach, a construct-driven approach when we're clustering, right? As opposed to just them simply being related. That's how bias can get built in, is we see things that are related and we cluster them without thinking about what they are, right? Here, when we do psychometrics, we think very carefully about what the things are before we cluster them, right? We have construct-driven approaches for building scales. Everything, you know, a scale for teamwork. The content needs to reflect teamwork and not whether you just are friends, right? That's a kind of bias. Or maybe it's not. You have to have discussions about it to sort this out, not just plug it into a clustering algorithm and let it decide. So psychometrics can really help the signal outweigh the noise. Is really the point here. And the signal builds up geometrically while the quirks build up linearly. So that's the beauty of measurement. Okay, looks like I have about 15 minutes or so, if that's okay. Oh, you're muted.
You can have we start a little later, so you can have maybe 20 minutes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'd love to have some conversation, so I'll try to be quick here. And in fact, I think this slide really reflects points I've already made, that we are construct driven. We build knowledge, right? We don't just serve prediction. I mean, if I went through machine learning algorithms, you would see, just like regression, right? We often look at, we look at coefficients, but we look at R squared, right? Machine learning essentially they would look at mean squared error, which is sort of the raw version of 1 minus R squared. It's like make the errors as low as possible when you're doing prediction. But we're more interested, we are interested in that. We want to do prediction, but we want to do the right prediction. We need to be defensible scientifically, knowing that relationships are tied to constructs. That helps us confirm or even build new theory, or both, right? We can confirm and extend theory. It also helps us justify our work, that it has value in practice. Like one of the benefits of using a test in practice is the fact that it actually does predict performance or teamwork or turnover or satisfaction or any of these outcomes that we care about for organizations, fit, things we care about for employees, right? But the only way we know how to do that is by knowing that we are predicting constructs. Those are the circles at the top that you've seen in a factor analysis class, or if you haven't. The top part is the construct. Those are the substantively meaningful things we think about as psychologists. They're latent, they're unobserved, and we have to observe them as best we can through indicators, right? Which could be items like the small squares you see at the bottom. Could be that we create more reliable composites. That's the middle part, and that relates to the correlation matrix I showed you, right? We create a scale that amplifies the signal above the noise. And if we created the composite right, in other words, if we combine the items that reflect the construct of interest and don't have too much noise in them, then the relationship between the very top, the construct, and the scale will be strong, right? That conceptually and statistically will have a strong relationship. And often in organizations, right, you can't have multiple scales, right? You can have multiple items, but you have to pick a scale. So you better pick one that represents the construct of interest conceptually, and then if it does that and has, right, even before you collect data, you have to have that kind of mindfulness about what you're measuring. And then that combined with empirical, you still need to collect data on high reliability. That together leads to a defensible situation, and it leads to, when you have relationships or a lack of relationship, you know why, because you've aligned your measures with the construct. Big data doesn't have to be construct driven. The machine learning model I showed you, I put constructs into the machine learning model, but it could be anything. Number of door swipes that an employee had with their key card, right? Or their heart rate, or their facial expression, or, right? All these things that lots of data are being collected on can be put into a random forest to see if it predicts outcomes. That's where the complications come in. You can get robust prediction off of data that are, come from anywhere. So I'm going to skip some slides here, but I am going to say that, we can talk about bias here for a minute in an example. Okay, so I tried to find a slide here of, here are people supposedly drinking responsibly in the upper left and people drinking irresponsibly in the lower right. And the point here is that an algorithm in both cases might suggest that these people have a beer based on their past behavior, right? So So a predictive relationship, you know, if you're selling beer, you might want to sell beers to both these people, right? But Amazon might sell you things that, you know, I like donuts. It might sell me donuts. But donuts are not good for me in the long term. Beer's not good for me in the long term. How does an algorithm tell you when to stop, right? Maybe there can be algorithms, but that's separate from prediction, right? Is the ethics of all this. And are there regularities? These are regularities based on human behavior. We can make judgments about the good and the bad of that. There are other regularities that are not as apparent. So in the news, there was a story that people who liked curly fries were more intelligent because there was a relationship between the two found in Facebook data. If you said you liked curly fries, you had a higher cognitive ability score. Well, the news came out and people started eating curly fries and the relationship went away. It didn't make people smarter. You know, the point of that is you can find regularities in the data and there might be a reason, right? But it's not readily apparent. So again, we need explainable AI to get into relationships that are unusual. This falls in the category of unusual but predictive until you tell people about it. Alcohol falls in the category of, right, ethics and morality, and we can talk about other health data. We can talk about educational data and privacy issues, right, legal issues. Those are, you know, we've always dealt with data in context in our history of research, right? This is just another example of that in a sense. So bias, I would argue that the bias we're talking about in machine learning, it's always been around in different guises, right? Regression models are biased. They can predict things about the world that doesn't mean you want to go with it. A regression model might tell you to, I don't know, get more donuts or drink more, right? Regression can do that too, but it doesn't mean you should. So ethics surround all models. I'm going to skip a little bit and here talk about some of the previous slides were talking about how big data algorithms need to be more explanatory, and I already covered that. And here I want to talk about basically aspects of big data and AI. Like one thing that I think is important as you delve into big data yourself is to keep various aspects distinct in your mind. They're interrelated areas, so they're always they're always influencing each other. But sometimes we talk about big data and AI as if it were one thing, or as if it gets kind of confusing. And one way to get through the confusion, actually, a great way to get through the confusion is to be involved in these applications, right? I think we need to publish more hands-on applications showing people how this works in organizations. Interestingly, you know, the algorithms are pretty quantitative, but the experiences can be qualitative, right? Like you want people to know what situations you're dealing with any kind of research, but big data would be appealing to an audience, I think. Open science might get us there, right? Open science is about not just sharing your data and your code, it's about being more open about the research process. And I think we need to do that with big data. But you know, with big data and AI, I think we need to keep things separate, such as the technologies and the data, right? So technologies could be, you know, these videos, these Zoom videos, right? You could be collecting data on my face and analyzing it later and learning something, right? But the streaming data that come in through Zoom is different from the random forest algorithm, right? Two different things. And we need to be aware of that. You know, the robot that helps you in the hospital and, you know, maybe helps the surgeon or gives you medication, that collects data, or your watch, your Apple Watch, that collects data in real time, intensive amounts of data that these algorithms get applied to. But the point is to keep those distinct. We need the technologies potentially to learn about constructs in new ways, like dynamic constructs like resilience or teamwork. If we can measure these things better over time, I know some of you have been involved in experience sampling studies to do that. If we can do that more intensively with big data, that's great. Maybe we learn something more. Adaptability, right, is discussed as a dynamic construct, but in the original thinking, they didn't have the measures to look at it in these data-rich ways, and didn't have the algorithms and the computing power to be able to do it. And by the way, I should have mentioned this. One reason to do big data algorithms, machine learning, is that when the number of variables exceeds the number of cases, you can't do regression. Maybe you've tried. You cannot invert the matrix, you get errors, you can't do it. So you almost have to engage in these methods if you want to proceed even. So anyway, legal and ethical context is obviously distinct from the data, distinct from the technologies, and distinct from the analyses is the point of this slide. And useful to think about those distinctions in your writing. Then you have general purposes where, oh, I have another slide that repeats the cultural factor. I guess I didn't need 2 slides, but big data brings people together, right? We have grants about them that pull people together. And I think the cultural phenomenon is just as productive and interesting as the algorithms, right? The fact that you can get, and in my setting at Rice University, we get engineers and applied statisticians in the same room with psychologists and sociologists, where we may not have done that before necessarily, and certainly not in the same kind of analytic context where we share some knowledge. So there have been bridges built. I think that's important. Big data can be an advisor, like don't drink that beer, don't eat that donut, exercise more, right? So by advising you in real time, that can change the data that get collected, right? If you change your behavior, the data changes, and you have conclusions about the responsiveness to an intervention, when you responded, how you responded, and so on. And the way you're advised is the bottom left, is the analyzer, is being able to do machine learning in real time and give you the decisions. And the bottom right is a scientific resource. For example, personality. You collect data on personality. You might be able to build on the big 5 in ways that haven't been done before. So I think these factors also need to be kept distinct in thinking about what big data can do for you, from the macro cultural factor to the academic research insights, and to what's done in practice in terms of informing you and advising you. Okay, I think we've covered most of this. This is my cultural factor in organizations, that big data, when you get sold like an enterprise system, that's where data are across the mechanisms of an organization, right? HR, recruiting, hiring, and managing and promoting teams and employees, maybe even looking at team performance, right? It's all integrated. And the fact that it's all integrated gives you more capacity to do big data, right? Enterprise systems have more data, but it also integrates roles, right? The roles can come together. And that's important, because then you have diverse people in the organization maybe willing to talk about a broader big data project, because their variables, in a sense, are in the model. And so I think if organizations are willing to build the culture around that, and many of them are, you sort of get this, I hate to say a business term, right? Sound like a cross-functional capacity, but it's true that these issues are broad and inform multiple areas, and make practice better, but also make research more relevant. And I think that's an important issue, is that I've seen a lot of opportunities for researchers. We're always behind, right? Because science is slower than practice. Science might make more type 1 errors, and we might make more type 2 errors or something like that. But I think more opportunities to collaborate is always better. Reliability, validity, and fairness. I'll conclude with that. I mean, we just cannot forget these standards as you evaluate products that use AI and big data. In my area is personnel selection. I'm thinking about how reliable is it, right? If I'm supposed to be measuring something stable in a job applicant, then if I test them 2 weeks later, unless they learned something, right, unless something construct relevant happened, their scores shouldn't change 2 weeks later, right? I shouldn't be giving them random numbers and doing selection on random numbers. Random numbers, though, are unbiased. So when a company when a test vendor brags about their measures being unbiased, you have to think, well, a coin flip is also unbiased. But I don't think you're paying a lot of money. A company doesn't want to pay a lot of money for a coin flip, right? They want to pay money for measures that are fair to the applicant, but also predict outcomes and are reliable. So that's the red lettering at the bottom. Don't forget that. Despite the aspects above that are also undeniably important, it's undeniably important to make fast decisions. You might even give up some validity for making quick decisions, right? If the best process takes 3 months to select an employee, those applicants are going to go away before you're ever, right? You say, aha, I found you. You're the best person. We want you. They're like, I'm gone. I had to have a job. So you might go faster and still sacrifice some validity because you have to. So I understand that. These last slides really deal with the conversation about, I hope to have inspired you to think about these issues and to think about how to incorporate them in your work. And really these slides are about that. I do editing currently for JAP. I'm finishing up at Journal of Management. I also do a methods journal for APS, Advances in Methods and Practice in Psychological Science. And in all these journals, they very much welcome big data applications. How you do that is, we're still learning. So what should you report in big data analyses? How do you fit that in with your thinking? How do you combine it potentially with traditional analyses? Or maybe implied by that is my point that maybe you should, right? You can do more traditional analyses and also do big data analyses. You could do regression, you could do big data and compare results in some cases. In some cases, again, you can't do regression because you have too many variables. But there are lots of opportunities for innovation. Journals welcome innovation. Editors want to, the old saying is that editors want to accept articles, reviewers want to reject them. And the editor is really trying to pave the vision for journals in the science to welcome new work, and big data is a new field. So you're a little more accepting of some trial and error because we're figuring things out, as opposed to other areas that are a little more entrenched. So I would certainly encourage you to be involved. You can become an expert just by the field has a lot to catch up on, and being involved at all, I think, can put you far ahead of others if you have an interest and become an expert. And then, the general advice, I didn't know who my audience was, but just networks can be really useful to vet ideas from, to learn from, and definitely, for your graduate students and so on to make use of that. That's where I'll conclude. And thank you again for having me. This was really great. And again, I hope you had a couple ideas, and I'm always happy to follow up. And let's chat now if you have some time.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Fred, for as I said, a very enlightened, presentation. So I'd like to, from the others, if anyone wants to ask a question, you can do it in English or in Spanish. We can translate for you.
Well, I have a question. I mean, it's a very pragmatic question, which is, I know that at SOCIPCO you have done, I mean, not you, only you as SOCIPCO, you have done some kind of competitions between, for prediction.
Mm-hmm.
And so the pragmatic question is, in general, how better are machine learning algorithms over OLS regression, for example? I mean, I guess, artificial intelligence and machine learning, it's a bunch of different things and not only prediction, but my pragmatic question is, if I have a data set, a big data set, how better I am using a machine learning algorithm as opposed as a mere OLS regression?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one reason I covered random forest is that it tends to outdo linear regression almost always in terms of out of sample prediction. I hate to say, I say that with some reluctance because I'm saying this categorically, right? No matter what your variables are, but that's not true, of course. But in many applications, you'll find random forest finds something robust that linear regression does not. And there are lots of questions around, there are lots of trade-offs and issues around that, so obviously. So one, which might be implied by your question is, I do linear regression, I get interpretability. Why would I increase my R squared by 0.03 and lose interpretability almost entirely? I mean, I know what variables went into the model and I know what came out, but I don't know what happened in between, how the variables were differentially weighted or if they were even used in the case of thousands of variables. So, old-fashioned linear regression can do a lot for you in terms of interpretability. Even if you cross-validated linear regression, a lot of people don't even do that. So doing that could show you something just in terms of realistic prediction as opposed to idealistic prediction by overfitting a sample. Yeah, so like I said, I've done machine learning workshops, and I used a relatively small but useful data set. It's relatively clean and no missing data and those kinds of things, just for teaching purposes. But there, and I didn't do this on purpose, you run a bunch of algorithms and you find out in terms of error, like linear regression is always at the bottom. It's the sad algorithm at the bottom that doesn't, it still predicts, but it always has more error than all the others. That's pretty typical.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for your great presentation.
Yeah, thank you. Other questions? I'm happy to ramble. I could talk about stuff. Hey, Etta.
I do have just a comment or a concern about the implications of data science for our discipline and the curriculum for IO psychologists. So we have, as a discipline, we have, I would say, especially in the doctorate level, I would say strong research methods and statistics emphasis, and throwing in data science to it, it will start like we're going to like becoming programmers or applied statisticians at some point. So one alternative would be to replace our traditional statistical methods such with data science. What do you think about it? How would you approach this from a teaching perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm looking up I'm going to email you my syllabus in statistical learning. So just so you, in case it's of interest. So I taught it recently, but the bigger point is, this is what got me interested in this in the first place, that big data, everyone's excited about it. So I wonder what it is. And I think about that in terms of my grad students who are obviously seeking employment. And I'm thinking, because I teach methods, I'm like, well, how am I going to teach this? And there's only so much time in the day. Am I going to give up a course Should I give up psychometrics? No, I'm not going to do that. Should I give up traditional statistics? No, I'm not going to do that. So how do you do this? And I think, you know, I have a few different kind of feelings around it. One is that at least some of us need to be involved in order to be engaged in these conversations, and to, if we want our science and practice to have an impact in broader communities, I think we at least have to be engaged at various levels. So you're going to have people that are programming in R and Python all day, and that's a very small number of people, but we need a few of those. You're also going to have people that have some training at least, and could get into the weeds with somebody, you know, ask the right questions in terms of technical issues with an applied statistician. I think I'm that kind of person. I do some R programming, but I can at least, and I don't know, you know, serious, you know, the most current machine learning breakthroughs, but I can certainly ask the right questions and be in tune to people that are involved in these applications. And then there are people where I think at least who, you know, people who've gone to talks like mine, at least you have some general sense that gives you some understanding of their approach and how it contrasts with, by they, I mean people who have been decades ahead of us, with our thinking, which is psychometric, and we have some top-down thinking that I think I know can be of great value. So I get people, now that people on campus have found me, my scent, they come to me and they say, hey, you know, I'm interested in, a recent case was career development. So they not only want big data, they want good data. So they're like, how do I measure vocational interests? How do I measure intent to major in a degree in college? And you know, some things are more behavioral, like you know, what major do you have now? So it's kind of a one-item measure. It's hard to ask that many different ways. But others are more psychological, like how do you get at student engagement and motivation? And that's more substantive and where our expertise comes in. I think I'm not answering your question, but I think the reason I got involved in this at all was because I was trying to figure out how to teach graduate students. And one example is psychometric, where I gave a talk at SIOP a few years ago now, where I showed how network modeling, you know, a big data approach to clustering, gives you similar results to a factor analysis, you know, exploratory or confirmatory. And so then the question is, from a practical point of view, if my answers are very similar, which one do I teach to grad students? And that's where I ended my presentation. Like, I'm not going to tell you how to do that. I'm just telling you that there's a different way to approach this in a way that might link communities together. So I think I'll answer your question by saying that's a great insight and a continued struggle. And I don't think we should ignore it, because it does offer an opportunity to not only to learn big data approaches to measurement, but for people from other fields to understand our approach, right? Like we have, psychometrics helps, we have thought really hard about sources of bias and contamination to our measures, right? When we talk about method variance, or when we talk about social desirability, or when we talk about test anxiety, right? Or, you know, sort of the broader issues of discrimination and prejudice. You know, people, yeah, I'll leave it there, but we know how to think about it and intervene as IO psychologists. Like, what are the right interventions? We also know how to control for it if we have to worry about it as a, you know, after we collected the data, how do we figure out what our sources are? So we can deal with it proactively and reactively, and we have methods to do that. So maybe machine learners will become a little more psychometric, and maybe we'll become a little more machine learner.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question. Hey, Fred, thanks for the presentation.
Yeah.
I have a question about the black box. If you can go back to the issue, I believe there's, at least in Europe, a lot of pressure to make AI more transparent. That doesn't happen in South America, in Chile, certainly not. I'll give you an example.
No.
There's a company offering video interviews being analyzed by AI, just like HireVue in the US.
Yeah, yeah.
In the beginning, people had no questions at all. They say, great, I want to have all my interviews analyzed by this AI. But they start to have questions. Where do you think it's going to go, the whole thing about making the whole calculations more transparent, the black box problem? Do you think it's going to be a pressure in the US to make it more transparent?
Yeah, very good question. So laws are coming up in the US out of these concerns, right? So, you know, I don't know the current, some of the specifics, but for example, we know about AI algorithms that are racially biased, right? Like if you have darker skin, it's harder to recognize your face, and that could lead, that it could be a random factor, but it could be a non-random factor where it's like that group gets treated worse or things like that. So out of these concerns for what these algorithms are doing, you know, particularly video interviews, there, at the very least, there are laws that require that you disclose how the methods, that your video is actually being used, because there were cases where it was more like a remote interview without any disclosure that video was necessarily being used, I guess. And so a little more transparency there. Like Illinois has some laws apparently about this. And then California, you know, where Silicon Valley is and everything, I can imagine laws there are continue to develop around fairness. And I think, you know, some companies have dropped their video actually because of, out of these concerns, you know, and with the Black Lives Matter movement, you know, that is heightened sensitivity around fairness, appropriately so, and giving these technologies a closer look. We have a paper we're currently, there are two papers actually that we're putting out. One is a broader paper that, if it gets accepted, really reinforces the principles that we know about reliability, validity, and fairness, that still matters with AI. So you're pointing to a clear fairness issue. There's also a validity issue. You know, are these, and this was true before big data as well. You know, you look at test vendor companies and you say, okay, you told me it's quick to administer, quick to score, gives me nice reports. A decision maker in an organization can actually do something right away. It integrates with, you know, to whatever your enterprise system is, Oracle, and all that sounds great. But does it predict anything, right? Are you giving applicants random numbers, or is it reliable, right? Those kinds of questions. And those have, you know, reliability, validity, and fairness has always been true. It's in our SIOP, the principles, right? So, and it's in the uniform guidelines, right? That these things matter, and so they still matter is the point of that article. So that's not very earth-shattering, but just say it still matters, and let's not forget. Another paper my graduate students and I have put together has gathered data across these new companies, right, that promote big data and algorithms. And we don't pretend to do a comprehensive search. We just did a pretty wide-ranging search to see what are they advertising, right? What is the reliability and validity being advertised? And it turns out, maybe you're not surprised, there's not much. And it does beg the question, who's at fault? Is it the science at fault because we don't impart the importance? Is the law at fault for not enforcing it strong enough? Are organizations at fault for not appreciating validity as much as, you know, they appreciate it in principle, but they may not appreciate that they need data to inform that in their setting, those kinds of things. But we have some data that's more of an empirical paper that complements the kind of more conceptual one. Very important. I mean, you're speaking like a true scientist practitioner and appropriately skeptical. And you know, you should definitely. I hope many people speak up with some important criticism. Right? We don't. I'm always in a position where I don't want to discourage innovation. Right? That's how you have to have people try. You have to have people make some safe risks. And so, but you also then, you know, while you encourage innovation, you also remind people of the lessons we've learned and the science that we've developed, right? So you don't want to be so stuck in tradition, but you also want people, you want to say, hey, look, we learned the hard way why reliability matters.
Fred, once I heard from a guy who was the owner of a company selling AI stuff in Chile, and he said something like, oh no, the whole thing about statistics in the old way, this is completely new. Forget about reliability, forget about validity. This is much better, this is more precise. You're doing the old stuff. That was basically his message. So
yeah,
don't talk to me about reliability and that bullshit, basically.
Wow. Well, that's amazing, right? Because reliability and validity, they are, you know, they're concepts as much as they are methods. So you could have a new method for assessing reliability, right? You could do clustering instead of alpha, whatever, right? You could have new methods for validity, right? Validity, I mean, at a very basic level, think of validity as the correlation between your actual outcome and your predicted outcome, right? So don't think about the X's, just think about the Y hat, the predicted Y, and Y, your actual Y. And any algorithm can give you Y hat. And that's validity, right? At some level, not that there's lots and lots of kind of substantive issues there. And of course the algorithms, but my point is to argue against that person and that idea is that validity still matters. You can express it in ways that are important in today's world.
That's
wow.
That's what I told him. He didn't believe me at all.
Please go back to him.
I'll go back to him.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I have a question about how to publish stuff using this approach. So you talked about the tension between Dust Bowl, empiricism, and the goals of science as theorizing and predicting and explaining the phenomena that you observed. And I believe that, well, John Antonakis was talking yesterday about, you know, some of the greatest discoveries of humanity have been done by chance or just by looking and inductively you know, finding things that are useful for us in some way, even if we don't know, even if we can explain them. And I believe that also Paul Spector wrote an article about discoverability as an alternative to just doing exploratory analysis. So, so the question is, how would you write a paper just saying like, no, we have this data and we want to know what predicts why? How would you approach that?
Yeah, well, I think there's a continuum between confirmation and exploration, right? We obviously have exploratory and confirmatory factor analysis for a reason, right? Exploratory, and this has ties to machine learning, obviously. Exploratory factor analysis is where we may not know the factor structure that summarizes a set of variables, but we often know the variables themselves. And we do something with the analysis is principled. We know what's going on and how to kind of further our science through these summaries. And when we write up something like that for a journal, we talk about the procedures transparently and the variables transparently, the sampling transparently, and so on. same thing for machine learning is we need to be transparent in terms of how we are reporting. And I know there's a colleague I know who is writing a paper on that, how to report machine learning transparently. And, you know, while at the same time, you know, the data might be more or less random from an organization, right? We find prediction and it's a little surprising. And, you know, as John may have said, it might be just a chance discovery, right? Like, I think vulcanized rubber was discovered because of some rubber accidentally got dumped onto a burner or something. And, you know, sometimes that happens. I don't think it happens a lot. I don't think it happens a lot in any science. I think what happens is the key ingredients come together. So in other words, they're not selected entirely randomly. There's some variation, and kind of like the random forest, right? Where there's some variation and we get some wisdom across the set of variables. And then sometimes something amazing emerges from that. Like when we have meetings like this, right? All the expertise is here on Zoom. We don't know how conversations are going to evolve, but we lead to some extra knowledge and discovery. And so I think that's how I would write it up too, is like, you know, you express the nature and motivation behind variables and algorithms, and you can still call upon past discoveries and theories, right? Even if you don't know what you're going to find, surely you're addressing some issues that scholarship has addressed, and you can lay out some context, and then see what you find. And I think you know, one thing to be aware of is you know, the clarity in which you express your approach is what can sell a manuscript for publication. In other words, you may not have found anything, but when you don't find anything, the reader is going to say, is that because of you doing bad research, or is it because there really is nothing to be found? And you want to rule out the first explanation, right? You do good research. And so if you're clear about your approach, then maybe it's useful, and I actually, more than maybe, it is useful to let people know that your efforts, despite your best attempts, did not result in what you expected. So I'll give you a personal example. We collected some data on game assessments games were designed to explicitly to measure personality. They weren't very fun or exciting like most games that PlayStation might have. They were designed to measure constructs. So it turns out they were kind of boring. But that was a strong attempt to try to get at the constructs, and we failed. And we tried to, we applied machine learning, you know, to the mouse click data, and we could not succeed. So we wrote the paper up, we explained what we did, and we're gonna present a version of it at SIOP, hopefully, one of my students, Felix Wu. And that's good knowledge to have, right? To know that it's disappointing, but if anyone wants to try this in the future, they'll have a lesson from us that to say that, hey, these people tried, they made their best attempt, and what they did seems reasonable, and yet they didn't find anything, right? So we need to promote this. This is in the vein of open science too. We need to promote our successes and our failures, and I think at the very least, because machine learning is so new to JP and other journals in the field, we want to know, right? That's a selling point in and of itself. We want to know what you found using machine learning. And you might also, to Edgar's point, like you still might want to do traditional methods and compare and contrast what was found.
I have a question, Fred.
Yeah.
Simple question, but is there any advantage of small data compared with big data?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. A lot of ways to answer that. So one is sometimes small data is exactly where you want to be. So like, you know, I live in Houston and NASA is close to us. And NASA has astronauts, and astronauts are very small in number. So if I want to collect data on astronauts, you know, I pretty much have the population when I collect those data. And any issues about reliability and validity are really local to the sample. I can't do much about sampling error. You know, I almost have to be descriptive that the population is not infinite. What I have is what I have. That would be one approach. So in that sense, I would answer your question by saying some things might be very local to astronauts that don't apply anywhere else because of their special characteristics. Maybe they have, I don't know much about astronauts, but like, you know, they have a profile that is very different from other people. Super physical training, lots of technical training that most people don't have. So if your research question intersects with those uniquenesses, then it might be the case that you have to live with small data, and that's actually a good thing because they're so different. On the other hand, astronauts are people too. So you might get big data because what you're researching is not unique to astronauts, right? Astronauts have motivation, they sleep, they think, and it might be that the data from other sources inform the setting that you still might be interested in astronauts, but the data from other sources inform that setting, which is very akin to meta-analysis, right? And it's akin to Bayesian analysis, where you have, right, you have a local setting that is informed by the priors, right, the previous data collected in other cases, and you're going to update your likelihood, which is, you know, the astronaut data. The astronaut data has an effect, and you have all this other data from other settings, and you're like, hey, the astronauts are kind of like this, let's combine them in a Bayesian model. And the Bayesian way will strike a mathematical compromise and say, well, I'll move the astronauts a little bit toward the general finding to the extent that that data inform it, right? Which is a mathematical issue and a statistical modeling issue and so on. So it you know, professors never have a straight answer, but that's kind of how it is, right? That you can do both. You can describe your data in small samples. You can see what the big data inform or big samples inform, and combine the two. I'll say too, I'll put this idea in your head as well, and I don't know much about this, but in big data, they are concerned with small subsets of the data that are uniquely important. So like you might have a minority group that if you do bootstrap sampling, they don't get fully represented very well in any sample. And so their signal gets drowned out by the majority. So there's a concept called oversampling that tries to remedy that. And that's where my knowledge runs out. I don't know exactly how they do that, but the idea, I think, is maybe it's like stratified random sampling, that you bootstrap, right, more cases within the minority to get more signal. But that I think that speaks to your issue, to make small data more relevant in the big data analysis.
So can I jump in? So
yeah.
it's
after you, Edgar.
Okay, sorry. So it's a very quick question, but so I'm not sure if this is what Hector was pointing at, but like a very simple difference between the importance of when I prefer small data than big data is that if I have a small sample, but for example, I'm looking at the effectiveness of an intervention, and then in this smaller sample, but I have random assignment, for example, as opposed to like big data, right? And it doesn't matter if you have trillions of data. I'd rather prefer
Right.
like 1,000 people when you have final assignment and other issues as well, like regression discontinuity designs and stuff like that, right? I mean, I'm not sure if this is what Hector was going to, but I can see those differences. It might be unfair because, you know, it's different design and so on,
But another issue is people might believe that big data helps generalization or external validity. However, my reading is that is not necessarily true because it's dependent on sampling, right? If the kind of sample you got, because if your sample is not representative of the population, even when you got trillions of data points, that not necessarily means that applies to the whole population, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, you're talking here about, you know, I think a lot of things, but the rigor versus relevance issue that, you know, you can have control groups and get a phenomenon better, make inferences about causality through experimental samples that tend to be smaller. But there's a trade-off there with phenomena you find in the real world that might go relatively uncontrolled. And there are smart people out there trying to figure out how to do statistical control or how to interpret. You know, life has a lot of unavoidable confounds in a sense as well. And so sometimes you want to live with those confounds, knowing that, you know, there are possible alternative explanations, but at least you have investigated and maybe narrowed it down a bit. And then complementing that could be more the experimental findings that, you know, could be, maybe you found the big data results, so you go to the experiment, or the other way around. But that's a really good point. I walk around my campus a lot that you see behind me with a few friends of mine. And one of them is a neuroscientist who does a lot of single subjects research. So he looks at stroke patients and you know, how the brain is functioning after stroke. Obviously, this is not random assignment. You don't randomly assign people to stroke, but you do learn things about reliable functioning in the brain in ways that are stable and replicable and really advance the science. So there you have an N=1. And the big data maybe come from repeated measurements, right? So I think, you know, you can think statistically and philosophically about when you get repeated measurements from an individual, do you need to generalize? And how do you need to generalize? So sometimes people get stuck on, well, generalizing means the effect has to be the same value. It's like, no, I mean, maybe that's true in some cases, but other cases, generalizability just means that the phenomenon exists in an organization or not, right? That it doesn't have to be the same strength, right, of teamwork, you know, predicting collective satisfaction or something like that. It's just that, you know, it's a positive relationship. It exists in this context and not that context. It's not the exact value that matters. It's kind of the broader pattern of findings that could be useful and might be what you seek to generalize.
I think we have time for one more question by Lorena.
Hi. Very, very intriguing and wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. I am trying to connect your presentation to our presenter from yesterday, because he Professor Antonakis, who basically claims that he and another group of scholars turn around the leadership research by focusing on things like real performance versus common method variants that plague the field. I mean, most of us, or some of us that studied leadership a while ago know that methodologically it was very flawed, the field of leadership, and now it's much more sound. So I am wondering if this approach of big data that even a while ago, while I was studying, I would remember people would say, this is theoretical, it's not interesting. So yeah. I am wondering, I mean, I can see the potential, and it's obvious that from a personal selection point of view, this can be very, very powerful. But I'm thinking knowledge-wise, theoretically wise, to what extent have you seen or people really throwing away theories with the use of this data? Because we as psychologists, we tend to focus in a few variables. All of them come from our head most of the times. And it's more of the case that people from OB will focus more on real performance. So to what extent is this approach useful for throwing away many of the things we know, and maybe even working with larger models with more variables that will explain an organization performance that some scholars in management have been pushing for, to explain the organization as the dependent variable. People might, like Matt Abelson has been talking about that. So this I mean, maybe it's out of the blue, but this is some of the thoughts that you have inspired me. I don't think I'm ever going to answer them, but I would like to hear your thoughts.
Well, we're in constant pursuit, right? There's never a definitive answer, but I think I'm not a leadership expert, but I appreciate your point that theory matters, and that you know, there are a few different ways to justify that. One is think about even the recent past, you know, where technology was relatively limited. The ability to sample people was relatively limited, and labor intensive. And so what that meant was, when you conducted research, you had to make an investment up front, and you didn't want to waste your investment. You didn't want to waste your time. You didn't want to waste your money. You didn't want to waste your data, right? And so what did you do? I mean, you know, you're a smart researcher. So you said, well, if I don't have much time, if I have to spend a lot of time, if I've spent a lot of time, and you may not have much time to test each participant, that's the other thing, another constraint, and you have limited amount of money on a grant, then you had better pick the variables that matter, right? You don't have time to do big data. You can't just select any variables. You need to pick variables that matter. Well, and what guides variables that matter? That's theory, right? And theory can be a monolithic, abstract, and even kind of scary term. But more modestly, theory can mean use your head, right? Be rational, you know, be rational in what works, not just rational. Consult past data to see where the promising pathways seem to be, and design your study accordingly. You know, experimentalists might take it farther and say, I don't have big data in terms of my rats. I only have, you know, 50 rats, and I paid a lot for them. And so they should be the same genetic strain, because I want to make the within group variance really small, right? So they need to have no individual differences, and any differences I see are due to the experiment. So I also better make the effect really large, right? That you know, water versus sweet juice that they drink, that juice had better be really sweet, so the D value gets big, or the equivalent for organizations, right? The snacks for employees had better be really good. Not that they're going to be inbred strains of employees, but you know, you get the idea that a lot of control was important prior to big data to make results strong and make sure you found something, essentially. right? Not just to make it strong for its own sake, but we were forced into some artificialness in our constructions, but also we were forced into some good thinking at the same time in terms of picking out variables that mattered. Now with big data, you can collect anything, right? And put it in the algorithm. And if it's on your hard drive, you can hook it up to your computer and run random forests as long as you have an outcome to predict. And, you know, sometimes that can be reasonable because that's all you have. And if you want to understand an organization and they say, well, here's the data we have, as much as you would like to collect measures, maybe that's what you do for the time being, at least, is you say, well, I wonder if I can get some prediction here and understand something about the employees in this setting. And in that sense, big data is ripe for practitioners, right? Because that's the type of data that are lying around in organizations. Not that that's mindless data, but it's often not psychological measurement data. And so those, you know, to unite the two, I think is maybe part of the point, is to say, we have our theories and thinking that actually still profit from big data. We shouldn't throw it out the door. But then we also have opportunities, and maybe this is, surprises can come from established measures. They can come from big data, you know, incidental data that you happen to find. Try them both if you can as well. Across studies, of course, right? We're gonna have traditional studies and big data studies, machine learning studies, but also within studies, how can they complement each other? How can theory maybe lead to types of big data that are collected? How can big data findings lead to, again, going back from the Dorito of knowledge from machine learning, go back to measures that get developed and strengthen the signal, so we can iterate between the two. And I think in terms of the publication, a study that combines the two might be well received, right? Because you're tying yourself to theories and measures, but then you're taking it a step further. You don't have to do it that way, right? It always depends. You might have a compelling case for just doing big data and relying on past research. But I almost got, well, I didn't get kicked out of a SciOps symposium, but I was publicly, somebody was a little upset when I said something like, machine learning has not led to any great revolutions in IO psychology yet, that there's no book telling us to throw away our theories and go with findings from machine learning. And, you know, I was trying to be provocative, and I certainly was provoking somebody, but my point, I did qualify it. I softened it. I said, look, we need to keep doing this, but there are no findings that are telling us to leave our past entirely behind.
Right. Thank you. Okay, Fred, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very interesting, engaging, a lot of participation, which means that the topic is interesting for people here. As the president of this very small society of people here in the country, I really appreciate your interest to talk with us, to share with us. We are a small community of people getting stronger, increasing our interest, connected with people abroad. And we are very happy to have connections with people like you, with people like John Antonakis yesterday. So I just to say thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Hector. Thanks for planning this. Thanks to your team for making me a part of your conference. I hope you're enjoying the entire event. And you all are very, I appreciate the conversation, very stimulating and interesting, keeps my gears turning. And you're very friendly on top of that. So that's nice too. And I hope we'll get to keep in touch. And you can always reach out to me if you have questions in this domain, or you can Google me, and if you see overlapping interests, please reach out. And I love what we do in terms of our work. So hope your work's going well despite these are difficult circumstances. And I see Edgar's comment there. And yeah, come to Chile. I'd love to. I would love to. So thank you so much. And I hope that can happen. Pisco Sour. Edo introduced me to the most delicious drink, Pisco Sour, and I am still excited about it many, many years later of its of what it brings. And Edo, we should get on the squash court again one of these days.
Absolutely. I totally agree.
Yeah. So I trust this situation will finish off a pandemic and we have the opportunity to meet again in SIOP. We are not sure if SIOP is going to be the next year in New Orleans, right?
New Orleans,
yeah.
They're very flexible, I guess, because we don't know our situation, right? I assume, I haven't been involved, I assume the hotel has had to be flexible too. Like usually they say, you get these rooms and that's it, like you better buy them all. But I think they've had to be flexible because otherwise I think SIOP would just have gone virtual entirely. And I think many people are gonna have to stay virtual anyway out of health or family or, you know, even convenience. Like we know it's more convenient now and there's that option. So we're exploring, you know, new avenues for SIOP potentially, but I also hope we get back to some form of normal where we get to see each other because that's always more fun.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Fred.
Thanks again. This was very
much.
interesting and rewarding. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.